Hello, and welcome to Sara Potvin's Carbon Offset Video Report for MBA 612, the Denmark Energy Study Tour in May 2013. The purposes of this assignment are to calculate the additional carbon that we will be emitting by taking this trip and to communicate our offset strategy with a YouTube video or other online video post. For my purposes, I will be using PowerPoint with a recorded narration and will be uploading a link for our professor's use to YouTube. The first thing we had to do was choose a carbon trip calculator. I chose carbon footprint out of the many available based on recommendations from my classmates. The second tool I had to find and use was Google Maps, as I had to calculate many different distances. For the purposes of the trip, we needed to calculate all different aspects of travel. For this trip, it will be car, coach, bus, and plane rides for the entire 10 days of the trip. We did not include public transportation while we were in Denmark, as we felt that this would add a level of complexity that was unnecessary for this assignment. And one would assume that with Copenhagen having the goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2025, that they would have already measured and accounted for these marginal impacts. The first aspect of my trip is my car ride from my home in Brunswick to the Portland bus stop next May 10th, and the return trip once I get back very, very late at night on May 19th. A one-way mileage for this trip is 27.5 miles for a total of 55 miles. I used Carbon Footprint Calculator, entered the mileage, and chose my type of vehicle, which is a Mazda 3 6-speed manual. And it determined that my total car footprint was 0.02 metric tons of CO2. Then the next aspect of the trip was my coach trip from the Portland bus stop to Boston Logan International Airport. One-way mileage for this trip is 103 miles for a total of 206 miles round trip. The next bus trip is related to our trip to Lolland while we're in Denmark. We will be going from the Generator Hostel in downtown Copenhagen to Holby, Denmark, which will be 157 kilometers. Then we will be going from Holby, Denmark to a nearby town called Rudby, hope I'm saying that right, which will be about 7.1 kilometers away. Then we will be taking our chartered bus from Rudby back to the Generator Hostel in Copenhagen for another 161 kilometers. The total coach and bus marginal impact for my trip is 206 miles in the US via the coach lines, and 325 kilometers in Denmark via the chartered bus, for a total impact of 0.05 metric tons. It's important to note that 13 people will be on these buses sharing in these marginal impacts, so I divided the 0.05 metric tons by 13 people to determine my personal impact, which will be 0.0038 metric tons. Then I had to calculate the plane trip from Boston to Zurich to Copenhagen. Luckily, we are taking the same trip there as we are back, just reversed, and Carbon Footprint Calculator will calculate this for you using a stopover. I also chose to include radiative forcing, which the site described as an additional negative impact to the environment. I felt that it was best to include this because it's easier to offset further CO2 emissions rather than underestimating and causing more harm than good. The total flight footprint was determined to be 2.34 metric tons of CO2. It's important to note that I am not the only person on these flights, so as such I wanted to take the 2.34 metric tons of output and figure out how much specifically related to me. The best way I found to do this was to take the information on the aircraft that we were going to be flying and determine their capacity. I did this by looking each one of these aircraft up on Wikipedia and determining their capacity, and then dividing the metric tons for each leg of the flight by the capacity to determine how much was related to specifically to me. While it's probably not realistic to think that these planes will all be at total capacity, they probably will be with at least luggage, and being international flights, they tend not to fly empty. So I found my impact to be 0.008 metric tons for Boston to Zurich, 0.013 metric tons from Zurich to Copenhagen, 0.013 metric tons again from Copenhagen back to Zurich, and 0.009 metric tons of CO2 from Zurich to Boston. That is a total impact of 0.0426 metric tons related to my plane flights alone. The total marginal impact of my trip to Denmark can be summarized by car as 0.02 metric tons, by coach and bus as 0.0038 metric tons, and by plane as 0.0426 metric tons. That is a total marginal impact of my entire trip of 0.0668 metric tons of CO2 emitted. Just looking at this list, I noticed that the car is the most harmful part of the trip, even though it's a quick 60-mile round-trip ordeal. This makes sense because I'm going to be the only one in the car, and no one else will be sharing in my impact and emissions for that trip. Keeping that car emission in mind, that is what drove my offset strategy. I've decided to carpool to offset my emissions for this trip to Denmark. Luckily, the car trip from my home in Brunswick to the bus stop in Portland is roughly equal to my daily trip to and from work. I work at 300 4th Street in Portland. The difference is really only about a mile or two, and I used carbonfootprint.com to calculate and found that both trips, round trip, contribute 0.02 metric tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. Luckily for me, I have a coworker in Brunswick who drives right by my house every day, and it wouldn't be out of her way to stop by and pick me up. It would also be a benefit to her because I could help her pay for gasoline. So what I did was I took my marginal impact for the entire trip, 0.0668 metric tons, and I divided it by what I drive every day to and from work during the week, which is 0.02. And I found that in 3.34 days of carpooling, approximately, I could offset my carbon emissions for this trip to Denmark. Rounded up, I would say that I could become carbon neutral after carpooling with my coworker for 4 days. I hope to learn more about offsetting strategies and about protecting the environment in Denmark, and I'm sure that I will, given that these people are so far advanced of the American public. I look forward to the trip, and I hope you've appreciated and enjoyed my strategy and my calculations. Thank you very much, and my sources are to follow.